Okay. Yeah, so it's already 11 and I think we should get started. So from this class on, we're going to learn about the wastewater treatment. Okay, so we spent quite a lot of time talking about the chemistry, talking about the basic chemical concepts, and then in the second quarter, we mainly introduced the water treatment, which is mainly for the drinking water. Okay, so now we're going to jump into the wastewater treatment. And actually, a lot of the processing or a lot of the treatment methods are quite similar between the drinking water and the waste. Yeah, as I said, a lot of contents are going to be quite similar. So I think we're going to have a smooth third quarter here. Right. So I also went over the exam that you already submitted. I think most of you guys did pretty good. As you can see, for the exam problems, they're mainly focused on the design parameters, right? It's quite straightforward, and we have the conditions, and we can calculate what are the design parameters for the system, right? So hopefully I can get it graded, let's say, before the end of next week. Okay, so during this time, if you have any questions or if you feel that you didn't perform well in the exam, feel free to send me an email. We can discuss what is going on and come up with some solutions. Okay, so let's again do a quick recap of the basically last chapter. So last chapter, we talked about the water treatment. And specifically, we said water treatment is equal to drinking water treatment, right? And because it is directly delivering to the human for people to drink, so the water treatment is going to have a much more stringent standard, right? And the processing or the treatment method is actually more complex. So what is happening is that for the surface water, let's say for the lake or river water, it's composed of these processes, which include the screening, the coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation. And then after all the larger particles are settled down, we send the water through a centrifugation to remove the smaller particles. And finally, we have the disinfection to remove the living organisms, let's say the viruses or bacteria, before we send it out to the households, right? So that process is also called chlorination because this is the most common chemical that people use to kill the pathogens, right? So we also mentioned that for the groundwater, the softening is going to be more important because there are a lot of hardness ions, let's say calcium ion, magnesium ion, and we want to basically reduce the hardness or soften the water, right? To so that they don't settle down onto the pipes, right? Or people don't ingest too much of them. So these are the general methods for the water treatment. And in terms of wastewater treatment, as I said, a lot of the processes are quite similar, except that we're dealing with a much more polluted water, right? If you compare, let's say, the water from the lake or from the river, they're going to be much more cleaner and they have less contaminants in there. So, and because of that, we need to first know what is the characteristics of the wastewater. So here, what is showing is the properties of the municipal wastewater, right? So these properties are going to include both the physical properties and chemical properties. So first on the physical, what we know is that the water for the wastewater generally looks pretty gray or dark gray, right? It definitely doesn't look clear, right? In terms of the odor, a lot of them are very nasty, right? In terms of temperature, it's around 10 to 20 Celsius. And this is mainly because in terms of the wastewater, either coming from the residential area or the households or from the industry, people normally operate it under normal temperature. It's under very rare situation that people will use or generate wastewater under or below the freezing point, right? So the water is filled with a lot of solids inside. So in terms of these suspended solids, what people call suspended solids, Um, so the total amount is around 500 milligram per liter. So it's around 0.5 gram per liter, right? And half of them are particulate. Okay, so they can suspend in the water for a very long time. It's like the colloids that we described earlier. And then further, a quarter of them are settlable, which means that they have a larger size. And if you give them enough of long time, they can settle down onto the basin or settle down onto the bottom. And because the wastewater has a lot of solids, basically the water is going to look very turbid, right? And that's why we have to deal with these contaminants or pollutants. So this is the physical property. And in terms of the chemical property, so here, what I'm showing these numbers, and including numbers shown in here, these are just some general numbers. Let's give you some understanding, let's say the approximate value or ballpark of the contaminant level, but the detailed wastewater property really depends on the source, okay? So if you further look at the table in the textbook, actually, these numbers correspond to the mild, so the mild condition of the wastewater. So people can also have strong or strongly polluted wastewater, right? Or lightly polluted wastewater. So this is just a mild condition, which is for a lot of time the general condition for the wastewater. All right. So in terms of the BOD5, for the wastewater, it's around 200 milligram per liter. Okay. So we mentioned that the maximum dissolved oxygen is around 8 to 8.5. Right. So what this means is that the BOD is too large. So actually, you can calculate what is the ultimate BOD, BOD 0, right? So the ultimate BOD is definitely going to be larger than the BOD 5. I think we also had the exam problem in the second exam, right? So you can calculate that based on the rate constants. So what this means is that there's no way any living organism can live in this wastewater simply because you don't have enough of oxygen, right? All of the oxygen are consumed and you have so large amount of the organics. So people also measure the chemical oxygen demand, right? So the chemical oxygen demand is around 500 milligram per liter. Okay, so just as a recall of the oxygen demand here. So here I have a first quiz problem, which is asking for what is the relationship between the chemical oxygen demand and biochemical oxygen demand. Okay, so we'll give it 5 more seconds for you to choose the answer. Okay, so I would say almost all of you got the correct answer. Okay, so the COD is always larger or equal to BOD. And this is not because of the number that I show here. Okay, so the COD, basically the BOD, to compare these two, we need to first convert the BOD5 into the ultimate BOD, right? We know that the ultimate BOD is larger than 200. But in terms of the ultimate, even if we compare the ultimate BOD or the ultimate COD, okay? So what we know is that the COD is always larger than BOD. This is mainly because the biochemical oxygen demand only talks about the organics that can get consumed by the bacteria, right? For example, the plastic bag or plastic bottle, they're considered in the COD because they're organics, right? They're organic, but the bacteria or the living organisms, they cannot consume the plastic materials, right? So that's why the BOD is normally smaller than COD, or it has to be smaller than COD. And at the same time, actually, a lot of the organics, they're when they're being consumed by the bacteria, they become a part of the bacteria, right? So not all of them are converted into carbon dioxide and water. So that's why COD is always equal or larger than BOD, okay? So I'm glad that you still can recall this concept, right? So in terms of the chemical properties, we also discussed the nitrogen, right? So the nitrogen in the wastewater is also under a pretty high concentration. So it can include both the organic nitrogen and ammonia nitrogen, okay? So basically you can include some organics, let's say carbon attached with nitrogen, right? You can also have the nitrate ions, okay, and ammonia ions, right? So their concentration is around 40 milligram per liter. So the nitrogen is quite important also because we discussed the concept of NBOD, right? The nitrogenous BOD. So there are CBOD, the carbonaceous BOD, and the nitrogenous BOD, right? So they're going to cause the oxygen demand, and actually they're also a type of nutrient that's causing the algae bloom and also the, as we discussed, the dead zone, right, in the Gulf of Mexico. Another nutrient that we learned about is phosphorus, right? Phosphorus can exist in many formats or the many chemicals. For example, the orthophosphates, polyphosphates, and organic phosphate. So their concentration is under, let's say, tens of milligram per liter. So there's also total organic carbon is around 50 milligram per liter, right? So generally the contaminant concentrations are much higher compared to the surface water. And that's why it's also called the wastewater, right? Because the contaminant concentration, if it's lower than the surface water, we can directly discharge them without any problem. So because it's contaminated, so the federal agencies, they set up standards in terms of the wastewater. So we have to treat them before we discharge them into the surface water or underground, okay? So in terms of the federal requirement, basically normally this is it's a less stringent requirement, but it still requires a secondary treatment. So we're going to learn later on what this means. So basically, for the wastewater treatment, you can have the primary treatment. Okay, you can have the secondary or tertiary. Okay, so basically, these treatment are going to get conducted in tandem, in series. So basically, the first step is the primary treatment, and then you can have the secondary treatment, tertiary treatment, and then you can discharge it, right? So if the water quality for the wastewater, let's say an industry or household, is pretty good, so we can just use the primary treatment. But in terms of the federal requirement, what the requirement says is that you have to do a secondary treatment before you discharge it into the surface water. Okay, so basically the primary treatment is a more simple method. You can just use the sedimentation to remove the contaminants. But the secondary treatment normally involves some biological processes. So we're going to learn more about these processes later on. All right. So this is a requirement in terms of how complex the treatment has to be. So they also give out requirements in terms of the concentration. So for example, the BOD5 has to be 30 in terms of the monthly average, or 45 milligram per liter in terms of the weekly average. So basically, what this tells is, let's say a wastewater treatment plant WWTP, wastewater treatment plant, discharge water out of the facility. Okay, so they will conduct weekly or monthly measurements to make sure that the BOD5 is below 30 in terms of the monthly average, or 45 in terms of the weekly update, in terms of the weekly average. So now we may have a question. So why the monthly average is smaller than the weekly average? Why is it not the reverse? Right. So this is our second quiz question. So I'm giving you a few options. So why do we have two different standards and why they are different from each other? So why they're not the same? Okay, 5 more seconds. All right, we'll stop here. So again, I think most of you get the correct answer, right? So this is just to make sure that, let's see. All right, so I think there may be some network problems. Let's just continue here. So I also have the PowerPoint. Maybe we can just directly use that. Okay. So this is your answer. I'm just sharing with you the choice. So basically, it's because of there are fluctuations in the contaminant discharge, right? So if we consider what is happening, so if we consider what is happening in terms of the discharge, let's say if we plot the concentration of the contaminants as a function of time, right? So what's going to happen is we're going to have fluctuations. Sometimes we can have very high concentration, sometimes very low concentration, right? So because of that, if we do the weekly average, then maybe we will conduct the measurement at these high concentrations here, right? But still, as long as the concentration is below 45, then we say that it's good, right? But in terms of the monthly average, what we're going to look at is the entire time periods. And we want to make sure that it is below a relatively low value so that it still satisfies the standard, right? So this is the federal requirements. And we also have the local requirements. So generally, they're more stringent, and it really depends on the watershed it's in, right? It's discharged to, because there are some ecosystems that are very fragile. So for example, we want to limit the amount of ammonia because we don't want to kill the fish, right? The total nitrogen. So we don't want to cause any algae blooms. And also we don't basically want to control the amount of E. coli because we don't want to harm the other, let's say the bacteria in the system, right? And also each treatment plant actually needs an operating permit. So we have to check what is the water quality. And also they need to prove that they're able to do these treatment processes because we don't want to accidentally spill the contaminants into the drinking water systems, right? So here, what I'm showing are actually a few tables regarding the wastewater quality. So as we said, so there are weakly polluted or the lightly polluted, right? The medium level of the pollutants and strongly polluted wastewater. So what I just showed earlier was the medium condition, okay? So actually people do a lot of measurements in terms of all the different, let's say, physical or chemical properties. Let's say the alkalinity, BOD5, chloride, COD, suspended solids, right? So for example, nitrogen here, right? Carbon, phosphorus. So as I said, the wastewater also strongly depends on the source from it. And this is mainly the domestic wastewater. So most of them are coming from the households, right? But in terms of the industry, it really depends on which industry we're talking about. So this is industrial wastewater concentrations. So it's listing a few industries. So we can have the ammunition, fermentation, slaughterhouse, pulp and paper, and tannery, right? Where people make leather, right? So you can see that the slaughterhouse and the tannery, they can have very high BOD values, mainly because we're dealing with meat, right? So meat is full of organics. We have to dump it into the wastewater treatment or the wastewater stream. And fermentation is pretty high as well. But in terms of the pulp and paper, the BOD is relatively low, right? And because of that, for different industry, they can use some pre-treatment to deal with the BOD5 and also the suspended solids before they discharge them into the wastewater treatment plant. So this is going to do a big favor for the wastewater treatment plant. Okay. So so here I'm also listing some conventional pollutant types and non-conventional pollutant types, right? So the conventional pollutant species are those that we're most interested in. People have been doing these measurements for a long time, right? For example, BOD5, suspended solids, pH, and different types of oil. And in terms of non-conventional conventional pollutants, then they're going to be, let's say, more detailed quantification of the physical and chemical species. Let's say ammonia, chromium, COD, let's say fluoride, nitrate. So they're going to be more detailed measurements here. But actually, EPA has done a very good job defining all the pollutants that may exist in the wastewater. So you can see that there are 126 of them. So people can do these measurements to make sure that the wastewater that discharge back into the environment, they satisfy the water quality, right? We don't have a, let's say, a very high concentration of mercury when you discharge them back into the environment. So finally, this is again, the EPA established established limits in terms of the different types of contaminants, BOD5, suspended solids, hydrogen ion. So basically, this is the pH, right? And the CBOD. Again, you can see that the monthly average is lower than the weekly average. So it is actually quite easy to, let's say, memorize the number, right? At least for the BOD5 and suspended solids, they have the same number here. One is 30 and the other is 45, okay? So now we have the standard, right? We know that wastewater is very polluted, right? And at the same time, the EPA has, I would say, pretty stringent standard, because if you recall earlier in this table, so this is what the BOD5 looks like, right? 200. And the target is 30, right? Which means that we have to do a lot to get rid of the BOD and also the suspended solids, right? So this involves the design of the wastewater treatment. Okay, so how does the wastewater treatment plant work? So before I talk about the details of the, let's say, the details of the wastewater treatment plant, I think it's good that we can go over a video first, right? It's going to be quite helpful. Keep it, and then share this.
It's a topic we'd rather not think about. Where does last night's dinner go when we flush it down the drain? While you may already be grossed out just thinking about it, this question leads way to a significant subset of civil engineering and a massive amount of public funding. Just like all dogs go to heaven, all drains in a city lead to a wastewater treatment plant where that wastewater gets turned back into water that we can drink. Now, you may be thinking that you'd rather just let bygones be bygones and not think about this nasty part of real life. But here's the thing. Chances are you've drunk water that was waste at some point, so you might want to take some time to understand this engineering process that makes dirty water clean. Here's where it starts. The toilet. Once you're done doing your business and flush that magical handle, your waste ends up at the inlet of one pretty interesting place, a wastewater treatment plant. Why is this place so interesting? Because it takes arguably one of the most disgusting substances in the world and turns it back into something that is essential to all life. Flushing just your toilet at halftime may not seem like a big deal, but when you couple it with thousands, if not millions, of others doing the same, it can result in some pretty high sewage flow rates. New York City has an array of 14 wastewater treatment plants that handle a combined 1.3 billion gallons of wastewater daily. That's enough wastewater to fill the Dead Sea with pure sewage in just 8 years. And that's just New York City. There are an estimated 14,748 treatment plants in the US alone that 76% of the USA's population relies on, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers. Understanding wastewater is crucial to understanding the critical infrastructure needed to support modern life. That brings us to the first step of the process that handles larger items in sewage, things like flushable wipes, 2x4s, toys, or even guns. You name it, and it's probably been caught in a bar screen. Bar screens are exactly what you would think. They are large vertical bars that stand at the inlet of nearly every wastewater treatment plant, designed to stop larger items from getting to the plant and hurting machinery like pumps. This first process where bar screens are used is commonly referred to as pre-treatment. The sole intention of pre-treatment is to remove the outliers in the sewage and make the whole mixture a little more homogeneous, or slightly less chunky. Bar screens are typically mechanically raked at certain intervals, depending upon the flow rates of the water treatment plant, although some older plants will still have more manual removal processes. Whatever is removed from the bar screens is then sent off to your average landfill or solid waste handling facility. Or, in the case of unusual items such as guns, they're sent off to the evidence locker in a police station to be investigated. Next up is the grit chamber. Grit chambers are the next steps in the pretreatment process following bar screens. Since these bars don't catch everything, larger particles called grit still need to be removed from the sewage as it is made even more homogeneous. As the sewage flows into the grit chamber, the velocity of the rather viscous sewage is adjusted to allow for particles of sand and rock to settle out. This is needed because these particles can't be removed using chemicals, and they could potentially clog or destroy pumps later on in the process. There are 3 types of these chambers: horizontal grit chambers, aerated grit chambers, and vortex grit chambers, which all accomplish the same task using slightly different methods. Following the grit chambers, the sewage will move on to the primary treatment process, which starts with a large basin called a primary clarifier. Primary clarifiers, and clarifiers in general, function on the principle of settling velocity. This term can be defined simply as the speed at which a particle settles. For wastewater being pumped into clarifiers, it's important that the flow rate of the water being pumped in doesn't exceed the settling velocity of the particles trying to be removed. In order to accomplish this, engineers will vary the size and number of primary clarifiers in accordance with the plant's permitted sewage flow rate. This ensures that at varying flow levels, solids can settle out of primary clarifiers to the correct quantities. At this step in the process, the slightly treated wastewater, which is referred to as effluent, is free of solids larger than 10 micrometers and should be all organic matter, which will be treated further. The top layer of the clarified water flows over a weir wall and into the next basin in the process, called the aeration basin. Now begins the process of secondary treatment, the sole focus of which is to significantly degrade the biological content of the sewage. In many cases, this process starts with aeration basins. Effluent flows into the aeration basins, at the bottom of which are hundreds, if not thousands, of tiny air blowers that create bubbles through the water. The water is pumped into this tank along with something called return-activated sludge. You can think of return-activated sludge as a bunch of happy little bacteria that get to eat their favorite foods all day long. This introduction of significant amounts of bacteria along with the massive amounts of oxygen injected from the bubblers creates an environment perfect for the process of aerobic digestion. Summarized simply, it's the breakdown of organic matter along with the use of excess oxygen. Some older plants will add in another step before aeration basins referred to as biofilters or trickling filters. Found in many older plants, these filters essentially trickle the effluent over a medium like stone or plastic and allow for a film of bacteria to chow down on any organic matter in the water. This step is largely not used in newer plants due to more efficient and effective modern processes, but for plants with basins already installed, many still use them because they only benefit the treatment process in most cases. Following aeration basins, the effluent along with much of the sludge is pumped into a secondary filter or clarifier, where some of the sludge is removed and pumped back into the aeration basins as the return-activated sludge. Further settling of larger particles is also accomplished in these basins, as it is the final step of the process that will remove solids and larger biological matter. Water flows out of secondary clarifiers over a nearly identical weir wall to the primary clarifiers and moves on to the disinfection process. At this point, 85% of all organic matter is removed from the water, and the effluent should be safe to drink in most cases, although you probably wouldn't want to. Disinfection is the final step of the process and is usually accomplished in one of three ways, either through chlorine, ozone, or ultraviolet disinfection. Each process has its benefits and drawbacks, with each being used commonly throughout the wastewater treatment process across the world. Chlorine disinfects the water through chemical disinfection. Chlorine, which you can think of as concentrated bleach, is added to the effluent here to kill off any remaining bacteria and organisms still living in the water. When chlorine is added to kill off the bacteria, it then has to be removed before it can be discharged, as to not kill off anything in the discharge location. After this, the water is safe enough to discharge into a stream or lake. Ozone disinfection is another method of disinfection that involves pumping an electrical current through the water that causes oxygen molecules, O2, to disassociate and combine with a free oxygen molecule, forming O3, known as ozone. Ozone is an incredibly strong oxidant and causes microbes' cell walls to leak, rapid cell decomposition, and overall damage to cells. In other words, it kills off bacteria. The last common method uses ultraviolet light to scramble bacteria's DNA so that they cannot multiply. In UV disinfection, the bacteria in the water aren't killed, rather they're sterilized, rendering them harmless. If you were to ingest water with living microbes immediately following UV treatment, any harmful bacteria would be unable to multiply or render your body damage. Engineers choose between these methods based on a variety of factors such as flow rates, cost, and location of discharge, which brings us to the final step, effluent release. Effluent release exists in one of two forms. In most cases, the now treated water is released back into a stream or lake or other water source. In rare cases, usually in areas where water is scarce, the effluent discharge from a wastewater treatment plant can be discharged into another treatment plant directly where it will be treated further for consumption. This is referred to as full-cycle water reuse. From a chemical perspective, the final drinking water is the same as normal treated water that flows through your pipes now, but due to the connotation of your drinking water being sewage just days before, this treatment process is normally shied away from or not heavily publicized. The entire process of wastewater treatment takes on average 24 to 36 hours from when a drop of water enters to when it leaves. Each wastewater plant will receive a permit for flow rates, chemical levels, and effluent quality, among other things, from the EPA that outlines the necessary treatment for a plant. Wastewater plant operators will make adjustments to a plant's operation and constantly measure levels to ensure proper discharge and proper treatment. Without these operators and the dirty job that they do around the clock, our sewage would always stay sewage, and sanitation in modern cities would be much, much worse. Wastewater treatment is an essential dirty job, and you can thank the 14,748 treatment plants in the US alone for not having to worry about what happens when you flush.
Okay, so I think this is a very nice overview of the wastewater treatment plant. So just to summarize what this video has said. Um, so here I'm listing the components that were mentioned in the introduction. Right. So for example, if we want to remove very large debris, right, we're going to use the screen, right? So basically the bar screen that can block these larger chunks of contaminants, let's say wood or larger pieces of equipment. So after these larger parts, basically solids are removed, there are particles or solids that exist in the medium size range, right? So we're going to use a grit chamber to basically remove these relatively large particles. For example, a sand grain, right? So they cannot get blocked by the bar screen, right? So in the grit chamber, they can basically settle down or use some inertia to remove them. So then these pre-treated water will go into a primary clarifier. So basically, these steps are called the primary treatment. Okay, so I'll just write it first treatment. Okay, so basically this is categorized as the primary treatment. So for some wastewater, if they have very good water quality, we can just go over the primary treatment, then discharge it back into the nature. But the federal requirement is that for the municipal wastewater, we have to go through the secondary or even the tertiary treatment, right? So the secondary treatment, what it does is it's going to remove the organics. So if you consider here we're just using the physical methods, right? So it's either blocking them or either letting them to settle down. But in terms of the chemicals, we didn't deal with the BOD at all, right? So because of that, we have to use the aerated chamber or the biological treatment. So basically to send in these aerobic or bacteria to let it do the aerobic reaction, right? To introduce oxygen and also provide, since we have a lot of organics inside, so the bacteria can just consume the oxygen and also consume the organics so that they can basically reduce the BOD or the concentration of the organics. So in that way, we can remove the carbonaceous species and also the nitrogen and the phosphorus species, right? So this is basically categorized as the secondary treatment. And then for the tertiary treatment, we can have the disinfection. So basically to further remove the pathogens, to remove the bacteria. Actually, we introduce bacteria in the second method, in the second stage, right? So we have to get rid of them before we discharge them into the nature. So that's why we need to use the disinfection to basically kill these pathogens or these bacteria. So here I also have a schematic diagram that's showing this wastewater treatment process. So basically, it starts with the raw sewage, right? You can use the bar screens or typical screens to remove the larger solids. And then for some of the wastewater treatment plant, they also use the comminutor. So what the comminutor does is basically breaks down the relatively large chunks of solids into grits, into smaller or medium-sized solids. Okay, so there are blades that's attached onto these columns here. And then while they rotate, they can cut these larger particles that penetrate through the screens into particles with medium sizes. And then basically it's composed of the sewage, but with medium-sized particles. And then it's introduced into the grit chamber to further remove these medium-sized particles. Okay. And then the treated water will go to a primary clarifier. So as it introduced in the video, what the clarifier does is it's just going to allow particles to settle down based on gravity. Okay, so it's very similar to the sedimentation basin that we learned in the water treatment facility, right? So when we do the coagulation, flocculation, and then we introduce the treated water into a sedimentation basin. So that's allowing the particles to settle down based on their gravity. So it's very similar in this primary clarifier. It's just allowing the smaller particles to settle down onto the bottom, right? So this is called as the primary treatment. So the primary treatment does the bar screening, does the cutting of the particles, does the grid chamber process, and the primary clarifier. And then if we worry about the chemical species, let's say the BOD or nitrogen or phosphorus, what we're going to do is we introduce them into a aeration tank. Okay, so this is going to go through the biological processes. But before we introduce water in there, we know that because of the high BOD, there shouldn't be any bacteria inside. And because of that, what we're going to do is we can introduce some bacteria into the pipe here. Okay, so for example, they can be E. coli or they can be some other benign microorganisms which can consume these organics, let's say consume the BOD, right? So this is the introduction of the bacteria. And inside the aeration tank, what we do is we have an air compressor to continuously bubble the air, bubble oxygen into the tank. So as it says in the video, you can think of this process as the, let's say, the happy bacteria that can have unlimited amount of food, right? Because we have a high concentration of the organics. So we have the bacteria, even if they're in small amounts, they can quickly populate themselves, right? To increase their number into a very large population. And then we can efficiently reduce the concentration of the organics. And basically after the BOD is reduced, right? So they are guided out, and then they're sent to a secondary clarifier. So if you recall the primary clarifier, basically the clarifier removes particles based on gravity, right? And because we're raising a lot of bacteria in the aeration tank, they're going to grow in their size, right? They can form chunks of bacteria. So basically in the secondary clarifier, these larger chunks of bacteria, they can settle down and then form these solids. And then at the top is going to be relatively cleaner water. And then we can send them through the disinfection, right? We can add in the, let's say either chlorine, or we can add in ozone or UV disinfection to further purify the water. But as you can see, the secondary treatment is mainly dealing with the aeration tank and the secondary clarifier, okay? So the disinfection is categorized as the tertiary treatment. So basically the water coming out, you can further, basically you can just discharge them into surface water, or you can go through more tertiary treatment processes. So now we deal with the water, right? So we basically come up with relatively cleaner water from the raw sewage. This is clean water, raw sewage. Okay, so what happens to the solids? Okay, so how are we going to deal with the solid that coming out? So the solids are, some of them are in the bar screens. So we can directly dispose them in the landfill, right? But in terms of the solids that's coming out of the grid chamber, they actually form something called the sludge. So basically you have the solids, but also in the solid, there are some water inside. But so before we dispose them, we have to first dry them, right? So this is what comes out from the primary clarifier. And in terms of the secondary clarifier, if you consider what is the major composition here, so of course there may be some, let's say, suspended solids that are basically not removed by the primary clarifier. But more importantly, there are a lot of bacteria inside, right? Because we basically culture them in this aeration tank here. So their population grow a lot to form these larger solids. But if you imagine at the beginning, we have to introduce some bacteria into the aeration tank, right? So what that means is we can split a fraction of this solid. So what people call activated sludge. Okay, so we can split a fraction of it and then send it back into the inlet of the aeration tank, right? So basically we have a lot of bacteria. at the bottom of the secondary clarifier, we can split a fraction of it, send it back into the aeration tank. So to enjoy the unlimited organics or unlimited food again. But most of them actually get disposed. Okay, so they're going to mix with the primary sludge and then go to the sludge treatment or disposal. Right, so this is the general process for the water treatment, for the wastewater treatment. And what we're going to do in the following classes is that we're going to do some calculation regarding the primary clarifier and also the calculation regarding the aeration tank, because these processes needs very accurate engineering. Because just think about it, if we send in too high of a flow rate into the primary clarifier, well, the flow rate is too large that we don't have enough time for particles to settle down, then the primary clarifier is not effective to remove the larger particles. And in terms of the aeration tank, what happens is if we send in too little of the bacteria, then they may not populate themselves enough for the in the aeration tank. And if we pump in too much of the bacteria, then at the beginning, they don't have enough of the food, right? So they're going to get killed. And that's also a waste of the waste of money in terms of sending them into the aeration tank. So there needs a lot of engineering calculations here. All right, so this is a general process for the municipal wastewater treatment, and it's commonly used for the wastewater treatment plant. So further, there are some information regarding the sludge disposal, right? So about the solids that we introduced earlier. So it needs thickening, so basically to dry off the water. Stabilization means that we need to deal with the microorganisms, dewatering, and final disposal. As we said, so the wastewater treatment plant can accept whatever comes out of the households or come out of the industry. But what people also recommend is that the industry needs to pre-treat their waste before they send them into the treatment plant, mainly because as we showed earlier, so for the slaughterhouse and also for the tannery, they can generate very high BOD. So it would be great that if they can pre-treat their water in the beginning, right? So they can do some pH adjustment, organic matter removal. So they can use similar methods to basically feed in the bacteria to remove the organics. And they can also remove the toxic materials, right? So this is all about the municipal wastewater treatment. So there are also on-site treatment systems. So we're going to cover this in our next Monday's class, all right? So that's all for this class, and I'll see you next Monday.